Hey everybody, Gromos here with another video, and this time I want to take a look at the game I did not have on the channel before, and that is Heliborn by Cat Games, which is at the moment in alpha and early access on Steam. Now, unlike what I usually feature on my channel, Heliborn is not a simulator or a realistic game, but an action game. I guess with some similarities to games like World of Tanks, in that it is a vehicle-based game, though with helicopters. So this is a bit of a departure of what I usually have on the channel, but I do also consider myself a gamer and I do play a lot of games, not just simulators. Though usually I stick with simulator games on the channel, as it usually fits my content better. However, I saw some videos of Heliborn on, for example, RamJB's and Mac's channel, and with me being more interested in helicopters lately, I thought I'd give it a try. And I have to say, even though the game is still pretty early in its development, I have a lot of fun with it and I see a lot of potential in it. Much more so than in other vehicle-based action games that I have tried recently, in my opinion, with the developers more willing to try a different approach rather than just trying to copy World of Tanks as closely as possible as some others have done. And I figured I'd make a quick video introducing this game a bit and explaining about what is planned for it a bit in the future, and also give a little bit of feedback on it. Because while it is an action game and not a sim-based game with its focus on military helicopters, I think it might still be interesting for some of my viewers, as I guess like me, many of you are also at least occasionally playing action games. And again, I think this game, while it is still early, has some great potential in my opinion to be a fun and immersive helicopter game. And quite frankly, in my opinion, it deserves a bit more attention than it is currently getting. So without further ado, let me give you a bit of an overview of what Heliborn is. Based on what I have played about it so far, I am still pretty new to the game myself though. As I have mentioned, the game is currently in early access and, unlike similar games, it is not a free-to-play model. It is a more traditional pay model, and at the moment it costs $10 for early access. The price for the final game, as I understand, is supposed to be around $30, though that is not fixed yet. You also have a more traditional server list instead of just pressing a battle button. Now, as you can see, Heliborn is a PvP game in which you fly helicopters, of which there are a large variety in the game already, from transport to attack helicopters and from the most early ones, like H-13s for example, over Hueys in different versions to modern Apaches and Ki-28s, or Blackhawks in the more modern scenarios. And you fight other players flying helicopters, somewhat similar to, say, World of Tanks or World of Warships do with tanks or warships, you could say, but there are some significant differences, which I welcome since I'm not actually that big a fan of WOT or World of Warships. Now, one of the primary differences is that you don't just fight enemy players, of course, but also ground units. As a matter of fact, supporting your ground units and capture bases and the like should be your primary focus. That is how you win a round, as it is at the moment. You can shoot down as many helicopters as you want. In order to win the round, you need to capture the bases on the ground and destroy the enemy ground forces. And that, of course, is a good thing. Because if you want an immersive helicopter game, the primary focus should be at supporting ground forces in some way, whether that be destroying enemy tanks or by bringing troops to the fight with a transport helicopter. Now, at the moment, as you can certainly see from the footage, helicopter versus helicopter fights are still very much what you do the most in the current early state of the game, but this is, from what I can gather, supposed to change as the game progresses in development, and I will go over what is planned there a bit after I talk quickly about what we have now. Currently there are 4 different maps available in the game that you can play, and they also represent different time zones, with the first 2 maps being Vietnam-style scenarios covering the times from the 50s to the 70s with early helicopters. Then there's a desert scenario with helicopters from about the 80s to 90s, and then last but not least a Kosovo scenario with modern helicopters. And there are quite a few different helicopters already in the game. They also have generally 2 to 3 different loadouts to choose from, with different weapons, autocannons, machine gun bots, rocket bots, ATGMs and even some heat-seeking AA missiles available, depending on the type of helicopter of course. We got all kinds of different rockets from S5 to S13s, Hydras and Sunnis, gun bots and autocannons in the game. Now the ATGMs currently all use a circular-style guided system. I don't know if there are more differences planned here in the future. As it is not a simulator though, I don't think that would be a big deal if it is not the case. And while this is an action game, you still have to keep a few basics in mind in order to hit your target accurately while moving with those different weapons. If you strafe sideways, for example, you will have to counter the impact that has on your projectile by adjusting your aim point accordingly. Also, depending on the type of helicopter is how many troops the helicopter can carry, of course, with attack helicopters usually, for example, not being able to carry any, with the exception of the Hind. And this is an important part of the game because you use those troops to capture bases on the map. The way this currently works is that you have to destroy the enemy forces on the base, which are, for example, AA guns manned by infantry, tanks and APCs. And once you do so and the base is cleared of enemy units, you can land on it and your ground troops will jump out and man the weapons on the base and capture it. On some bases there are also vehicles or boats to take over that will then fight for you, like you might have seen with the patrol boats when I flew the Mi-2 earlier. If you capture the entire map, you won. That is the basics of how the current game mode works. And at the moment you can freely pick from all the helicopters that time-wise fit on the map, and you can pick whatever loadout you want on them. So at this stage all the helicopters are unlocked for everybody. With the game finished there will be a bit of progression with unlocking some things, but I don't know how much exactly at this point. But there are also big differences planned compared to similar vehicle combat games, which I appreciate a lot. Now, the helicopters will eventually be, depending on their age, be part of 1 or 4 or 5 tiers. Well, so far so standard, but the thing is that in Heliborn you will right from the start have a helicopter unlocked in every tier. So this way you don't start with the oldest one and work your way up to the newest helicopter in the game. You can start with modern helicopters if you prefer. That should lead to early helicopters not being the newbie stuff, as it is the case with early vehicles in games like World of Tanks, for example. The tiers should be equal in this regard, so even as advanced player you can focus on, say, Korea or Vietnam era helicopters without being considered a seal clubber as the term is. Which I think is a nice spin on the system, letting you decide what era you like the most and not forcing you into a certain tier because that's quote-unquote high tier. You can compare that to, for example, the wargame games, Red Dragon, Airland Battle and the like. That is the strategy game series Wargame, not Wargaming, the company, by the way, to avoid confusion. Where you can also specialize at older designs and units without that meaning that you're playing at a lower tier versus newer players. That I find great, because in many of those games I actually prefer the older vehicles and the older scenarios, like in this case Vietnam. And it's also no accident that I mentioned those wargame strategy games, as there are other upcoming game design elements planned for Heliborn that are also inspired by those titles. At the moment, as I said, you just join the game and you can freely pick from the helicopters available on this map. On your side, of course, there are no mixed teams, so either you're on the Russian side or on the NATO side. Now, the way this is supposed to work in the future is a so-called deck system, meaning just like in the wargame titles, you can build a deck which has a certain point value overall. The helicopters will be first part of 1 of 4 tiers, and your deck can have helicopters from 2 of them, like 1 and 2 or 3 and 4. You will have a total of 70 points to spend on your deck, though that number is subject to change, and the helicopters have a certain point value, so you can either bring more weaker helicopters with a lower point value, or fewer but stronger ones, or a mix of your liking, again inspired by the deck building system you can find in the wargame titles, where it also works like this. That sounds like a cool concept that is, at least for a vehicle combat game like this, new, and I think has a lot of potential, and I like seeing some new ideas in this genre, as some other games in it are in my opinion stuck with some concepts that are quite frankly outdated. Now, the loadout of the helicopters you choose will also influence that point value. Of course, if you bring stronger weapons, the point value of the helicopter will go up, and in some cases might even change the tier the helicopter is part of. Take for example a AH-1J Sea Cobra, the Marine Corps version of the Cobra, with 2 engines as opposed to 1 in the early army ones. Now, there are 3 loadouts on this helicopter in Heliborn. The first one has only unguided rockets, and still the early closed nose typical for Vietnam-era Cobras. The second and third loadouts feature tow-guided missiles or sidewinders and have the newer nose with the sighting system you know from more modern Cobras. So this would be an example that might just have a lower tier with the loadout that comes first and a higher tier with the later one. The amount and type of troops your helicopter carries in its loadout, if it carries troops, will also be adjustable and have an influence on this overall point value of the helicopter. For now you just have a fixed amount of normal troops to capture bases, as well as 1 or 2 guys carrying man-bats you can drop. Later there will also be, for example, mortar units or maybe anti-tank teams planned. Now, ground forces in general are supposed to play a much bigger role in later iterations of the game, as the developer said they want the player to have more of a focus on supporting their ground troops instead of dogfighting other helicopters, to get more of a helicopter feeling from the game, because in reality fights between helicopters are of course rare. Now they did happen of course, for example during the Iran-Iraq war. Iranian Cobras and Iraqi Mi-24 Hinds were fighting each other, but this is not the main focus of a helicopter, so I hope we later see bigger maps and maybe have the bases replaced with a more dynamic frontline system, where you can go on anti-tank missions for example, or reinforce hotspots on the front with your troops in a transport helicopter, maybe picking them up from a part of the front that is less hot and bring them to a spot where they are more needed. Maybe make NPC AA at least on some strong points on the map also a bit stronger, so you really have to fly low and hide behind buildings or hills or trees to sneak up on those to fire hellfires on them. Now, the developers have also talked about maybe adding sling loading into the game for transport helicopters, so you can for example move artillery pieces into position. And I do hope all of those plans work out, because it would be nice if we eventually get a nice little NPC war going on that you can try to win with your helicopter team. At the moment it is still focused a lot on helicopter versus helicopter dogfights. I hope this will change in the future, and again, that is what the developers plan on doing anyway. Another interesting point that is mentioned during a recent livestream was that the damage model might become a bit more sophisticated in the future, and when you get shot down, it might be because of an engine failure or tail rotor loss, and you can then, instead of just crashing, try to make an emergency landing via auto-rotation for example. Now again, this is not a simulation, so that won't be super realistic or anything, but nonetheless it would be a nice gameplay element. And they also think about maybe in this case, if you survive a crash like this, maybe a teammate can then try to pick up your crew and you get an extra life on that heli if they succeed. So that is a bit of a basic overview of what the game currently is and what is planned for it in the future. I think it is a fun game to play already, though admittedly a lot of the things that I am really excited about are still in the future and not yet in the game. Like the deck-based system, more of an NPC war going on the ground, and gameplay that is more focused on that than heli dogfights. Though again, I do think that those dogfights are actually a lot of fun to do. It's just that for a real helicopter feeling, even in a game that does not try to be a simulation, you want to cut back a little bit on how often they happen. However, on the other hand, none of those features and gameplay elements that are supposed to come are in my opinion all that hard to do, given some time. A lot of other similar products out there don't do those things not because they can't, but because they just decided not to. So if the developers here are of a different opinion and want to go a different route, I don't see why this would not eventually happen. I at least will keep an eye on this game and its development, and maybe feature it more often on the channel as well if there's interest, since, as I have said, I do think it's a lot of fun to play. Now, one thing I still want to mention really quick is a bit of feedback on pretty much the only element in the game in its current state that really bothers me a bit, and I want to provide some feedback on that. And that element are the heat-seeking missiles, Strellas, Stingers, Sidewinders and the like, that some helicopters can equip in the game. Of course, more often for modern helicopters than the older ones. Now, I have to say that in an action game like Heliborn, I'm never a fan of such self-guided weapons. In PvP, that is true not just for Heliborn, but other action games as well. I had a similar concern back when I played Blindside 2 for example, and even in Star Citizen I think that might become an issue eventually. I think self-guided weapons like this are always hard to balance and often are a source of frustration if you're not careful. So in my personal opinion, I would love to not have them in the game at all. But from what I have heard, that might not be an option. The developers want to include them, as helicopters in reality can also carry them, and that is of course true and an understandable argument. I do however think that they at least need some adjustment done, and let me explain quickly why. I am by the way only talking about the heat seekers used by players, not the man-bat teams. Now, the reason why I don't like self-guided weapons like this in an action game, a simulation is a different story, is that in an action game, in order to get a decent balance out of the weapons available, especially if they are different in their use and power, is on its base level to have stronger weapons be harder to use than weaker ones. And in Heliborne, with most weapons, this is the case. Machine guns and autocannons are the easiest way to hit an enemy helicopter, of course, with their fast rate of fire and muzzle velocity, but the amount of damage is not that high. In comparison, unguided rockets do more damage than if you hit with your cannon, but they are more difficult to get hits with, as they travel a lot slower and are more affected by gravity. And even within the rocket pods, you get a similar progression. The small S5 57mm rockets do less damage as they are small, but you get a lot of them and with a fast rate of fire on your rocket pod. The much bigger S13 122mm rockets do much more damage, of course, but you carry only 4 per pod, so you need to make your shots count. So there is a relation from the power of your weapon to how hard or easy they are to use versus another player. It's risk versus reward. Do you risk trying to attack with a weapon that is much more difficult to use and risk it doing nothing because you miss, or do you use the easier to use guns right from the start and risk losing because the other guy manages to hit you with a S13 unguided rocket, which does a lot more damage than your gun? Even with ATGMs this is true in Heliborne, which you can use against other helicopters, but again, you need to do it properly to make it work, you need to know how. Now, with self-guided weapons, this balance, however, goes right out the window. You don't have to worry about lead or drop of the projectile, you point them at the target, wait for the beep, press the button and you're done. Doing a lot of damage for very little effort on your part. You see, this is just hard to balance. Now, there are countermeasures, of course, flares in the game, but at the moment they are not all that reliable, and with heat seekers versus flares you still have a difficult time to balance it, as it is an all or nothing situation, with either the missile hitting and doing lots of damage, or missing and doing nothing at all. That is why currently those heat seekers and how they are dealt with in the future is what currently worries me the most. It has to be said though, of course, that the impact of those heat-seeking setups is of course bigger now, with the focus of the game still being more on helicopter versus helicopter fights, and the deck point system not here yet. Should the focus switch more to the ground attack role in the future, bringing a setup that trades ground attack munitions for air-to-air missiles might be a bigger disadvantage than it is now. Many helicopters have to sacrifice their ATGMs in order to bring AA missiles, which at the moment is not such a big deal, I find, but as the game progresses in development, losing those anti-ground capabilities might well have a much bigger impact. And with the point system introduced, you got another balancing element that is not in the game yet, and that might also help out here. We will see how those elements influence this issue. I'm still not a big fan, with the strongest PvP weapons being the easiest to use, and I fear I never will be. But there are certainly ways to balance this to a satisfying degree. We will see how it looks in the future. Now, having said that, other than those issues with the AA missiles, I have a lot of fun playing this game, and I think it would deserve more attention than it is getting at the moment. As even in its early stage, I find it to be more fun than other vehicle combat games currently on the market, and I appreciate that at least so far developers have shown the courage to try something different. Well, that's a first look at Heliborne. Let me know what you think. I would be interested in other people's opinion on a game like this. And well, this is it for this video. As always, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.